I just knew him as Ollie Bassett's friend. And then Ollie said to me, Noah's team won the World Championships. I went, what? Anyway, then fortunately for us, Noah rocks up at Waikato University, where he's going to be for the next 3 years. So I fished with Noah a couple of times. He's a great character, terrific angler, both a lake angler and a river angler. And yes, as part of the USA Youth World Championship team, they won the World Championships last year in Bosnia, which is quite something to achieve. So I thought we'd take the opportunity of having Noah on our doorstep to invite him to speak at the club and talk about some of the techniques they use and how you might apply those to New Zealand. The other thing that Noah and Ollie are famous for is when we had the club motor trip to Rangi this year, and the 10 of us caught a sum total of 8 fish between us. They were on the lake with us at the same time, and the 2 of them put 36 fish in the boat that day. So I thought I would ask Noah just to spend a couple of minutes talking about what they were doing differently than what we were doing, because it might be useful for folks who are going there this year. So that's a little bonus edition when Noah's covering the other stuff. Welcome, Noah Shapiro. Thank you.
Yeah, I have that at the very end, so I keep you guys paying attention to the other parts. So, don't do too many presentations, but kind of threw this together and hope it gives you guys some info and some stuff that you could use out on the water next time you're out going fishing. So, start off just a little bit about myself. I just moved here to New Zealand. I'm at college all over at the University of Waikato. I'm going to be here for 3 years, so you guys are going to see a lot more of me, for better or for worse. I've been fly fishing for about 14 years. I've been doing competitive fly fishing. I was lucky enough to make Team USA and compete at 2 different world championships, both in Italy and Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was also lucky enough to win the gold medal over in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was a great honor. Some other stuff I've done, I set the all-time record for number of fish caught in the US in a 2-hour session where I caught 87. And I was number 2 ranked in my region before I got here, and hopefully I'll go up and have a good time here and hopefully get some good rankings. But I just love going out fly fishing as much as I can. I love competition fishing, and I just love catching trout. So you'll see, please ask as in-depth and as nerdy questions as you can. The nerdier the better, because I love talking about this stuff. So Charlie told me to keep it 45 minutes to an hour. Yeah, I'll try. Yeah, so start off talking about the World Championships that we had over in Bosnia. It was very interesting water. There was a lot of challenges, and what I put as challenges and opportunities, because one of the things our coach said is, don't look at them as challenges, look at them as opportunities for you to outcompete everyone else. And so some of the challenges we dealt with is there was only 1 fly allowed in that entire country. That means there's no drag dropper. Through competition rules as well, you're not allowed to fish indicator styles and split shot as well. So that means in really deep areas, 1 fly to get all the way down, and in really slow flat areas, there's no indicator technique that you can use, which makes it a lot more difficult to fish. You can see this is our head coach, Josh Miller, out looking at some of the beats. This was my 2nd beat during the World Championships. And you can notice that it's very flat, it can be very deep, and there's not a lot happening. So that I've seen on some rivers around in New Zealand, you'll see these long, flat, deep, slow sections, and those can be really challenging and difficult to break apart if you don't use the right technique and understand how to really effectively do it. And that was the entire river that we ended up fishing for this World Championships. Some of the other things we had to deal with is it was incredibly hot. I just want to throw this out there. One of the days it got up to 44 Celsius, It was also 80% humidity on top of that. So just one of the challenges we had to deal with.
What time of year was it now?
This was mid-July. It was exactly a year ago in like 2 or 3 days. So it's been just about exactly a year. Very hot up there. The trout were technical, it was slow. I'm saying polluted waters because I just want to bring up this part of the story. Bosnia does not have good sewage. It was very disgusting. I appreciate how clean and how pristine the water is here because in Bosnia you have pipes that just go straight into the river. It was not as pretty.
So would you recommend eating the fish?
No, I would not. Did not recommend that at all. I remember there was one point I was wet waiting, so I was in my shorts. I looked over, and this was before I realized, I looked over and saw a pipe and I saw toilet paper underneath the pipe. I go, ooh, that's a mistake. So yeah, it was completely, it's interesting going to another side of the world where they don't really look at their water quality and everything else, and coming here and really appreciating what we have here and in the States. So, moving on, there's a bunch of different techniques we use and a bunch of different ways to cover this really flat water. The main ones we were using single dry. We were also using a technique called skated dry, which I'll go over in the next slide. Euro nymphing, when applicable, there's a few spots where there's just enough current that we could Euro nymph, and in those spots, there's lots of fish, so you prayed you had one of those spots. Long line nymphing, which is similar to naked nymphing, I think that is a technique that, if utilized correctly here in New Zealand, could be just a phenomenal technique.
What's the definition of that?
It's basically, we'll go more in depth, I have some more stuff, but it'd be like naked nymphing, where you don't see the fish, and you use the end of your fly line actually as your indicator, along with almost like a technique similar to straight line nymphing on a lake in moving water. So in a lot of those flats that we have in between the big runs, either way. if you think it's will be better, I have no clue. Oh yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
That's too dark.
Oh, that works. That works.
Put one back in between us, we can't see.
Yeah.
You can't see now.
Oh,
That's it, that's perfect.
there we go. You get a little bit of my face. So, yeah, we'll get more into it, but it's kind of a technique, especially getting around where you can't dry drop over, you only have one fly.
Yeah.
So it allows you to effectively fish this really difficult flat type water without suspension and covering it really effectively. So that's something that I think will be super fascinating here. I've even used it in a couple spots too. It's pretty good success. So that's definitely a really cool one. So the other thing we have is a Euro jig streamer. That's basically Euro nymphing, but using streamers, moving them across the current, and that was very effective, and also sinking line streamers. That's what I'm doing in this video here. I also put up this photo, and if you take a look at the mouth of that trout, it doesn't look like a lot of the brown trout we normally catch, and that's because it's not. It's a softmouth trout, which is only native to this river and the one river it flows into. It's basically in Bosnia, where there was no European grayling in the section of rivers, so brown trout evolved to fit the niche of grayling.
Yeah, I
So
thought it
this-
was a great looking picture.
Yeah, this is a brown trout that has a grayling mouth and kind of has a short fin, but a lot of them have a very big grayling fins too. And that's just one of the cool things about being able to travel through competition. You get to see fish like that, which I didn't even know existed before I went over there. So, yeah, cool looking fish. So we'll get started on the dry flies. There's two main styles that we use in terms of dry fly fishing while we're over in Bosnia. we use Spanish style dry fly without getting crazy into detail, but feel free to ask me if you want to get crazy into detail. What we're doing is we have our angler, they cast up, the fly line carries energy, and then you have about a 20-foot leader or so, as long as the leader is you're allowed in competition. But you're, oh, I need to do it in meters. You'll have maybe a 3 to 4 meter section of normal leader that will lay out, and then the rest of that will be just traditional tippet. And what that allows is the leader will lay out, then the energy will stop continuing, and that causes that loop that you have in your cast to just suspend in the air, turn around, and land your dry fly slightly downstream. And you might ask, why would we do this? But what ends up happening is you build up a lot of slack in the system, which allows your dry fly to not be as affected by the microcurrents as it's going downstream. And B, one of the interesting things, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but with dry flies, at least before I started doing this technique, I tended to get a lot of missed fish. And the reason for that is what happens is when you're fishing, and we're just gonna imagine this is my dry fly, if the fish comes like this, or line's coming off like there, the fish comes to eat, the fish's mouth actually will push the line and pull the fly all the way out. And the only real way to effectively have that not happen is if your line is directly upstream. So when the fish eats, the mouth goes all the way around the line, and then you always get better hookup on that fish. So the most effective techniques we'll see when we get into skating too, is where you can get your fly line upstream of the fish when it eats, because that allows when the fish to eat, it'll fully swallow that, and you'll get better hookup, and it won't push the line out of their mouth. I personally had a lot of experiences in the backcountry where I've had big trout come up, I didn't get the J loop right, and it just catches, and you see the fly fully just slide out of the mouth because it doesn't fully eat it. And that's with the slack and with the curve like that, you don't end up having to deal with that as much. So you still miss fish, it's not 100%, but it's definitely a effective technique. And then the other technique we used was skating dry flies. This is when the fish were a little bit more aggressive. When, for example, caddis flies, when they're laying eggs, they will move across the surface. And when the fish are a little bit more aggressive, they're searching for those dry flies. What we can do is we'll cast, let's say current's going here, we'll cast slightly downstream, put a mend into it, and then just pull it back and forth. And as it comes back and forth, it will skate up and down across the surface of the water. Where there's an aggressive fish, that movement triggers them a lot, and you're able to get overfish that are very rising here, rising there, but it's very hard to condition in exactly where they are. If you throw a cast and you skate it across them, that movement, that action will normally trigger them to come over, and instead of them feeding down a small feeding window, that opens up the window and allows us to cover a lot more water while keeping it, being more efficient and still getting the bite. The other thing I want to mention is you'll notice with the current going that way, I did that a bit confusing. With the current going up that way, you'll notice how when the fish eats, it still has the line upstream in this scenario, so you're still going to end up hooking that fish where it eats it and it fully gets it. So you do this technique almost entirely downstream, whereas this technique you can do upstream side or downstream. Some of the flies we use, they have these mayflies called Danica. Also have a bunch of fly examples that I can pass around or show, or we'll go over, but they have these Danica mayflies, which are very large. They're from like size 6 to size 10 normally. So you can imagine very large mayflies. We didn't use a ton of them, but if we couldn't get anything else, we'll throw something big. It's similar to our cicadas here. Might just get that reaction strike. We use some small split wing mayflies with CBC. And a fly I learned over there is a fly called a nonsense dry. And that basically has a little bit of cat's fur as a hackle at the front. And that catches tons of fish. That's super effective. So any questions about dry flies, anything like that? Ways to use them?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
What I understand the line between around backwards on the Spanish style, can you just go a bit on?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's hard to describe, but the basic idea is in fly casting, what we normally do is we want everything to lay all the way out flat, like that. So what we have is our fly line transfers energy, our leader transfers energy, and then it lays out. But what we do in this setup is we put a break in the leader, if that makes any sense. Normally we'll have like maybe 1 meter of tippet, 2 meters of tippet, maybe even more. But if you have less tippet, or a lot more tippet, and then you use a little bit less power, that energy won't fully transfer out. It will stop at the end of that meter. Maybe a little bit of tippet will go, but then it will just stop and kind of lay down where it is. So I can imagine if I'm casting not straight up, but at a sideways angle like this, my loop is going to be parallel to the water. Does that make any sense? My loop will be parallel to the water. So when I cast up, this will extend, and then at a certain point when it stops laying out, it will loop back over and not land on itself. It will land slightly to the side where the actual fish is. So, yeah. Any more questions, comments, concerns? Go for it. Yeah.
Sorry to bring this up, but when you were in Bosnia, were you away from the war zone?
So, yeah, no, it's a very interesting place to hold a youth world championships. There was no active war zone anymore. However, like a lot of the buildings that we were around, literally, they had bullet holes, and there's still, you can feel the tension just being there. We were lucky enough, our guide was this man named Alex. He was an incredible guide, and I don't know how, but seemed to know everyone there, and everyone liked him or owed him something, or we called him like the mafia man. Like he was in charge. He kept us all safe and kept us all good. But it was definitely a interesting place to go because there was that recent war zone and civil war. So definitely tensions going through the area. So yeah. No, I mean, I don't know what the hell the world's there, but hey, they had it there, so we went there. Yeah. I remember distinctly, I went to the bathroom, I walked down, and like, the bathroom had like 9 bullet holes in it. The stall, I was like, interesting. Anyway, yeah. Anything else, or should be good? Next, we're going into Euro nymphing and Euro jig streamer. I'm not going to go too far in depth in this because number one, Euro nymphing can be a whole nother class that there is a whole lot to it. The other thing is, this is one of the rare sections we could actually Euro nymph. For the most part, there wasn't Euro nymphing. This was a marble trout I caught during the competition that went 54 centimeter. It was just a stunner. I don't know how much it weighed, but it was a nice fish. I was the only marble trout caught in the competition, so shout that out. I was calling it Euro. But for Euro nymphing, there was a couple techniques that really reigned supreme. where there were stock trout, because some sections, some beats had stock trout, flies that we call jump flies just did incredible. That's the classic, the eggs, the mops, the worms, stock trout love them. And we have a lot of experience fishing those for our stock trout back in the States, so wherever we could, we do that, and that worked very well. The other thing, we had Alex style nymphs. Now these are really interesting. I'm going to scroll to the next one to kind of explain these. In Bosnia, since there's only one fly, and yet there's incredibly deep water, and in some rivers there's incredibly fast water, they have found a technique where they're able to get more weight into the nymph than you would originally see. So these classic scuds, they look a certain weight, but what you can see is they've actually put tungsten built into the body of the nymph, and that allows this, what would be a flow mill, to really weigh what would be equivalent 5 or 6 mil. And I actually have some Alex, so we can pass these around. But all these nymphs on this top row here all have tungsten built into the bodies, and that allows them to be even heavier. I have the
No, or is that based on the hand tungsten bodies you can buy? If you wrap red wire around them?
They're similar, but it's truly built onto the hook. So here's the original Alex nymph too, so you can look at those and feel free.
Oh, I see, you buy those.
Yeah, so our guide, Alex, is actually the guy who makes them, and I believe they're only sold in Bosnia. Like, they're really unique, but because of all these Alex nymphs, we're able to go fish some waters that we would be unfishable, waters that were probably 4 or 5 meter deep. We were fishing with one fly because we're able to use these very, very, very heavy nymphs that other teams weren't able to go through and fish. One more technique on talking about the jig streamer. There's this thing called a Italian style jig streamer. I'm going to buy the steel one so I can show it off. These are one thing I learned from the World Championships the year prior. They're not always applicable. It depends on how big of a profile the fish actually want. But if you look on the streamer, it's going to be really hard for you guys to see on the far in the back. But the marabou is actually tied in on this jig streamer next to the tungsten bead. What that allows is, if you can imagine the movement of our marabou, our hook actually sits farther back in the movement than what you would have.
So it's tied in at the head.
It's tied in at the head, yep.
Yeah.
If you tied it traditionally at the tail, you have all the movement behind the hook, but with this technique, you have the movement in, the hook goes
like
into the movement, similar to a wing. And that allows a significantly higher hookup ratio when the fish are eating, because a lot of times fish short strike streamers. So we're using streamers like this, which allowed us to have a higher hookup ratio when we're getting those bites. This is not the end all be all, because you can't really build in bulk on this type of style. So you can only work if you're fishing skinnier streamers. But if they're eating skinnier streamers like they did in Bosnia, then this technique allows you to get a significantly higher actual bite to hooking than what you would traditionally get. Moving on to this slide, kind of show you some of the junk we were fishing and when there's stalkers. These are tag nymphs, and they're tied with tungsten in the body, so they look small, but this would be the equivalent of like a 4.5 nut. Some of the scuds. And this was my working box actually the morning of before going to a world championship. So you can see we have some dry flies, a lot of junk, streamers, and then a bunch of nymphs up in the corner for what we were going for. Any questions on Euro anything?
So those super heavy flies, you could use those as people on the Tonga River or some of the faster rivers here will use a double beaded fly.
Yeah.
You know, not for competition fishing obviously, but they'll use 2 formal beads. You could use that sort of technology.
That would be similar, yeah. On the other hand, another thing I've been doing also, which does a very similar job, is just if you have just a straight 5 mil, 6 mil tungsten bead, that also gets it down really, really well and works really well. That's not allowed in our competition, sadly, but when, if you're not doing competition fishing, just having a really big tungsten bead, because when you think of the area of something, the bigger it gets, truly the heavier it gets. So the difference between a 3 mil and 4 mil, and 4 mil and 5 mil, there's a lot more tungsten in a 4 mil to a 5 mil than there would be from a 3 mil to a 4 mil. So even when you get up to like 5.5 to 6 millimeter tungsten, that has so much weight that also gets down there. But in competitions, you're not quite allowed to do that. So we have to find these kind of unique ways to get around it, you know? Yeah. More? Okay. So here's the long line technique. I also call it advanced naked nymphing. This is, we traditionally think here in New Zealand of naked nymphing as we spot the fish, we take a single nymph, cast it up, watch the fish's reaction to detect our strike. That's a really effective technique. This is a little bit different, but also can be utilized, I guess, in that technique. So how a long line setup works, we have a fly line, we'll have 1.5 to 2.5 meter of like 0.15. Then we'll have another 1.5 to 2.5 meter section of 0.12 to like 0.06, which is really small. We never use 0.06 here, but in Bosnia, that was some of the things we had to go to, some really smaller flies, or smaller tip it. How this works, basically, if you're fishing long flats, long technical flats, where fish are very spooky, they don't allow you to get close enough to check nymph like what we like to do in the States. So instead, you would cast up and you'd retrieve it down almost with just one fly right at the end. Now, where this gets really interesting is when you talk about strike detection, depth control, and animation. And what I'm saying with all those, number one, strike detection, you'll a lot of times detect a strike by having this little loop in the line right at the end. So you'll have this little loop, and whenever you get your bite, that loop will pull up. So you're just keeping up with your nymphs as you cast. When you get that bite, that loop will twitch up, and that's how you're able to detect a lot of strikes, especially even at distance, even at 10, 15 meters away, you're able to watch that twitch and be able to catch fish nymphing that far away, which can very much be utilized here in New Zealand.
This is really a sort of slow water technique.
This is a slow water technique, or shallower riffles, I would say. It's really technique meant for a lot of that water in Bosnia, and a lot of that just really slow water that you can't get close to fish. The other thing you can do with this technique is depth control. We always like to change depths with the weights, but you can also change depth with the speed and tension you're bringing it in. If you bring it in really fast, that fly is going to stay higher in the water column. If you slow it down and go deeper, also if you cast fully connected, it stays up. But if you do what's kind of similar to a tuck cast, keep your rod a little bit higher, that'll swing the fly down, let it sink all the way deeper down to the bottom before you get connected, and allow you to do the same drift at deeper motion. The other thing is I put is animating nymphs at distance. This is one thing I watched some of the Bosnians do. I still have yet to figure out. I can do it, but to the level they can, it's truly incredible. What they do is as they bring their line in, they bring in a little bit faster than the speed of current, then a little bit slower, a little bit faster, then a bit slower. And what that's doing is they'll cast their nymph, 15 plus meter away. As they're bringing it in, they're able to bounce it up and down along the current by bringing it faster. That pulls it up towards the surface. Then they go a little bit slower. They're able to jig their nymph through the water far out through completely flat water. That triggers, the fish go crazy. Again, I haven't fully even been able to utilize this technique, but the amount of control you can have on a nymph very far out to very spooky fish allows for lots and lots more fish to be caught. Where this can be really useful in New Zealand is where you have lots of those long flats, technical flats, that especially those in the higher density rivers such as the Waimak, stuff like that, if you're able to cast this up and control through your entire drift, you can get long, effective drifts through really flat, really hard to approach waters, and pick up a lot more fish than you would initially expect to do in those. The other thing is those long, flat, deep pools, you put a slightly heavier nymph like a 4 mil, you're able to watch the twitch and also watch the end of the fly line. And one more trick, lots of random tricks, but if you're able to use little marker pens like this, you can put that at the end of your fly line and you can watch the marker pen. It turns the end of your fly line bright pink and it allows you to watch that marker pen as it goes down, and you're able to watch both the fly line and the twitch at far distances and detect those strikes even without watching the fish in that naked nymphing setup. So that allows for some really cool like fly naked nymphing. Yeah. So any questions? I would love to dive more deeper in that. So any questions on this style?
Isn't that just like how people used to nymph fish before Euro nymphing was invented?
It's similar, but what a lot of people used to do before Euro nymphing was invented was more of that close-in check style range,
Yeah.
where they wouldn't cast more than, I'm trying to think meters. They wouldn't cast more than like twice the rod length out and fish kind of close in, and that also incredibly effective. Where this is different is it's not about fishing that close in area. It's about really being able to cast as far out as you can, stay as far away from the fish and still get that very effective drift and technique while staying 10 plus meters away from very spooky trout or grayling in a lot of these cases. So, yeah.
What's your total leader length there?
The total leader length, in feet, what we're doing is normally around 12 foot, which would be like 4 meter. But there's some ranges and lengths. If you're fishing a deeper area, you would go a little bit more, up to probably like up to 5 meter. I have both of them 1.5 to 2.5, both the leader and the tippet. The other thing is you would think you'd want a tapered leader as your leader, but what I have is a completely level leader. The reasoning behind that is because your leader is going to be cutting through the current. So if you have a tapered leader meant to fully lay over, that, what?
The tapered leader doesn't sink as well, does it?
Exactly. And it will actually catch the current almost like a suspension device. So it will almost act as a parachute to the faster water on the top. So instead you have that slower, non-tapered leader that will cut through and have a better connection to your nymph as you're drifting through there, as opposed to a tapered leader that would. Yeah. Any more questions?
Is it something you would more go from where the current's quite uniform across the river, or?
It's a lot easier where the current's uniform, and that is one thing we had over in Bosnia. We had a lot of very flat, wide, long stretches where it's a lot more easier. If the current's less uniform, I would still do this in a lot of scenarios, but just not as much distance because you just can't have the control as you would where the current's more uniform. But there's certainly, like I've seen some photos of the comps where you have like your riffles, some sections or there was from nationals this year, the Fanganui. There's definitely sections where it's just long, flat control, where there's no fish rising. You could kind of swing wets through it, but the fish still weren't up. You could pull streamers. That's a technique. But one of the techniques that I was thinking, just watching the nationals, is there's places where you could go, have your heavier nymph, and just cast that distance out into those areas and probably pick up some fish. So, yeah. It's a really interesting technique. It's still a technique I'm personally working on. I first learned about it over in Bosnia. As in terms of the distance part, like as Charlie said, there's a lot of traditional old style Euro that would be very similar, but the distance and the control at distance is, I would say, a whole nother technique with this long line. So
How rod are you using to do that?
say that again?
What size, what length rod are you using?
You use a slightly shorter rod than what we would do Euro nymphing. So 8.5 to 10 foot, I would say, in the range. So more like a traditional rod. You're still using 3 or 4 weights. And the reasoning for that is a lot of the time also this lighter tippet. You also don't want too heavy of a line because it still will hold in that surface tension, which is the fastest part. So you want a line, normally a 3-weight line is what we were working with, which allows it to still get caught in the surface and slow down, not make a lot of noise as well, because you can imagine if the fish are spooky enough that you can't get them if you get closer than 10 meter, then a big 5-weight line smacking near them.
Right.
It's not going to be very happy too. So 3-weight lines, and yeah, we're trying slightly shorter rods, which just allows more control of that loop in the air and more control how it lands, etc., etc.
So you're using a 3-weight to like a weight forward or?
Yep. 3-weight weight forward is exactly what it was. That was same if we go back with the Spanish dry fly. You don't want an extremely long rod as well, because the longer the rod, the less control you have on that loop.
Yeah.
So it's very good with high sticking Euro nymphing style. You have those very long rods. I was using 11 footers even in Bosnia. But when you're fishing dry fly techniques or any sort of casting technique, if you want a lot of control on your loop, just dropping it down to under 10 foot, 9 foot to 10 foot is kind of the range I normally look at, gives you a lot more control on what and how that loop is doing. So, especially you can imagine you want as much control as you physically can when you're doing a Spanish style dry, because, I mean, look at that. it's a pain in the ass. So, 3 to 4 weights, 9, 10 foot is better for that, whereas in Euro nymphing on these very large rivers, we're using 10.5 plus basically consistently up to 11 plus foot rods for the Euro style. Yeah. Any more questions on that? Okay, here's a fun one. This is definitely one I have used here in New Zealand. It's incredibly effective, and this was one of my top producers in Bosnia, just because its ability to cover water. If you have a huge long section of water, this works a lot better at covering than really any other of those techniques. What this is just fishing a single streamer on a sinking line. What we're using was from about 3" per second sinks up to 9" per second sinks, so some very heavy sinking lines when we're going into some of the really, really deep pools and pockets. Now, this is something I think a lot of us have a little bit more experience on, just considering how a lot of people can fish like the Tongariro with those sinking lines. It's very similar. One thing I would like, or a few things I would like to mention on this technique though, is one thing I noticed in practice and all my training with this technique is it's always fun to go and cast all the way across the river like this, but what ends up happening is you get the faster current in the middle creates a loop, and it will pull your streamers a lot faster than you actually intend down, and you miss a huge portion of your drift where you're actually going to bite. So how I like to do it, how I learned to do it, is you'll cast, you'll do a slight bend upstream that gives the line time to sink down. Once it sinks down, then I do a twitch where I'll pull it in, let it slide back out, pull it in, let it slide back out as it swings around. But the big part is you don't want it to be moving vertically very fast, because if it moves vertically very fast, that's very hard for the fish to actually catch up. So instead you want to just have a controlled up and down movement and kind of slowly pull it in front of the fish instead of pulling it vertically very fast. The other thing, you can see I kind of threw in a little triangle up in this photo of me fishing this jig streamer. And what I'm pointing out here is if you look at my rod tip, it is fully underwater. That is very important in both lakes and rivers when fishing sinking lines. If you have your rod tip on top of the water, there is a technique, especially with nymphing, where you're able to watch that for the strike. However, a lot of times you're going to do a lot better in that hookup if you're fishing a sinking line. If your rod tip's in the water, you will have better detection, strike detection on those streamers. And if you keep that in the water as it swings across, when you get that bite, you also have a better chance of it actually hooking into the fish and landing them. And the reasoning for that is because with the line out of the water, with sinking lines, you have to pull the heaviness of the line to get connected through the air, where it's not as hard with the water because the water will kind of hold on to that, if that makes any sense. So that's one thing I see a lot, that's one mistake I see a lot of people make, is when they're stripping both in rivers and lakes, when they're stripping sinking lines, they have their rod tip out of the water. I like to keep this angle at the angle of the sink, so I have a direct connection. So if I'm fishing a very heavy sinking line, it'll be at a very steep angle. If I'm fishing very close to the surface, it's at a very flat angle. But either way, that rod tip's gonna be in the water. Yeah.
I never do that, so that's really
I noticed that when we were on Mariah time. I'm like, interesting, try it.
So what are your leaders and tippets at?
Oh yeah, so sinking line, we have a small section of 10-pound Maxima chameleon. Then we put a tippet ring, and then we'll put 1 to 2 meters of 1x to 3x with 0.25 to 0.2. So on the thicker side, a lot of times when we hook these fish, you kind of just pull them in because they're not as big of an Bosnia. So that's less of a fight. It's just more, when they eat that streamer, it's either a reaction or an aggression bite. So the tippet size matters a little bit less. You're able to still get those bites on a thicker tippet. And then the other thing is when you have that thicker tippet, you just don't lose fish. You lose a lot less fish on 0.2 as opposed to 0.06. So whenever you get the opportunity to fish that thicker tippet, especially in the streamers, you take said opportunity. The reason we have this setup is that's kind of how the setup I have in a lot of my lake lines too, because I was transferring a lot of my lake lines over for this technique to get the variety of sinking, because I have lake lines at different sink rates. So you have a little section of 10-pound to a tippet ring, and what that allows in lakes is you're able to quickly switch between lines by just reeling it in, having this stay at the rod tip, pulling this out, putting it in your new line, tying the knot, pull it out, and it pulls the line straight through, so you're allowed to. It's basically the technique setup we have on our lake lines, and it works very well on the river lines too.
Do you, with the connection to your line itself, are you using loops or are you tying directly onto the line?
I tie directly onto the line with a nail knot, and that just creates it slides through the rod a lot easier, and yeah, it just slides through the rod a lot easier. So the biggest point in this whole system will be that 2.5 mil tippet ring, which you probably, considering there's only 1 to 2 meters here anyway, you're probably not going to get to that point when you're bringing in a fish. So this setup just allows less problems to happen if you're fighting a really nice fish or fighting any fish, because nothing should get caught on the reel. Yeah, loops work well too, but you always have to be a little bit worried about the size of that knot, because when it gets, if it gets caught, that sucks. That's not useful. Any other? Actually, we have another section. So.
Why don't you use tip lines for that, just out of interest?
We could have used some tip lines. A lot of sections were very deep to the point where tip lines, I don't think would have fully gone down. Maybe a really, really heavy tip line, but tip lines would have worked. The other thing, for a reason that we weren't using tip lines is because in a lot of those sections of water, the speeds at the top and the bottom were surprisingly different, despite how flat it was. So if you cast it on the top, the tip line would catch the top current, where the bottom current, it wouldn't catch as much. So the sinking line anchors it down into the same speed as the streamer actually was. That being said, would tip lines have worked in a lot of the scenarios? Absolutely.
I just asked because it's so difficult when you're wading that deep to cast the full sinking line, because the lines will line around in the water. Did you have trouble with that?
This is a photo you can't see in this photo because I wasn't wading as deep as I had previous. But one of the techniques I like to use is I'll pull my net off my back, I'll put it between my legs, so when I pull in, the current comes around me, will pull the line in, and it will deposit my line right into my net, which means instead of having it to pick up all the way from the bottom, it'll pick up there. Also, as you can tell, in a lot of these scenarios, I was preferring to cast maybe like 10 to 15 meter max, which is a little bit easier to shoot out 10 to 15 meter as opposed to shoot out 30 meter, because in a river with lots of currents, shooting out that 30 meter, you don't really have that much control for the first 15 meters of that retrieve for the most part. So I was deciding to stay a little bit closer in with more control as opposed to casting farther out with less control. And instead of casting that farther out, I just use myself. You can see the water line on my shirt is like up to here. I would just put myself into the position to get that right drift as opposed to casting to that position. So I'd be there and have the right control. A little bit on the flies. This is our guy Alex. We love Alex. You can see I did catch a fish after that photo was taken. There's a couple interesting flies. This is my classic Lucky Leech. I love it. And these are the two main flies we're using in Bosnia. You can see, oh, I left my UV light. But we have some of those over in that box. The interesting thing, this is bright orange. That's for the stalkers. Stalkers see something bright orange, go crazy. But with this fly, you can see there's a little bit of orange holographic. And what ended up happening is we actually have the orange marabou from this fly wrapped underneath the flash. And that gives it a little bit more of that UV element that that allowed, the fish seemed to like it. That was just one of the streamers we found worked really well over in Bosnia. That being said, I've had a lot of experiences with streamers, and in my view, put a black streamer with an orange head in most places. The fish seem to like it quite a lot. So I don't know if this technique was necessarily the best streamer for it, but it's just the one we were told works really well, and we went in and it did, so no reason to change up there. But a lot of times streamers are reaction or aggression bites as opposed to feeding responses. So in that case, with both reaction attacks and aggression attacks, it's not, oh, this has this little bit here, this little bit there. It's, oh, that thing's annoying. I'm go eat it, or that thing's in my face. That's one thing I've found with streamers is it's a lot less the fly and a lot more just get it and you rip it, and the fish like to eat it. Any questions about sinking lines and streamers?
How did you retrieve them much, or was it more focused on just it swims with the little balls?
That's a great question. Where there was stalkers, retrieve was big. The stalkers were definitely more aggressive. So when we were in sections of water where there was a lot of stalkers, ripping it in just a little bit faster, and also always at the end we'd pull it in, that worked quite well. However, not all the sectors had stalkers. Where there was the wild fish, that pull-in seemed to get a lot less of a response. It was a lot more that twitch as it was bouncing down that you'd end up getting your taps on or getting your bites on. At the end, you pull it in, and sometimes you get your bites, but it's a lot more, at least here in Bosnia. I don't know if it's the same here, or actually I've done it here and I've seen wide variety depending on the river, so you kind of have to just do it via the river system. But in Bosnia, the wild fish were going a lot more on the slower natural swing, where the stalkers just want to chase something down. And you had to, there's one place where I literally cast rip, boom, to get the bites. So it really depended on what you were targeting in that beat. Yeah. So
With the wild fish, do you find a variation in beak colours with? I mean, like I find here, time of day, clarity, beak colour makes a difference.
I find here absolutely the same. And in the US, I've seen so many scenarios where the bead color seemed to matter. In Bosnia, we were really keying in on, they were mostly in copper, pink, and gold beads for us. Whereas silver was okay. Black nickel was right when you were fishing in really pressured water. So there was definitely some key in on bead color. It was a little bit less pronounced than what I've seen here and what I've seen back in the States, but there definitely was some paying attention to like what bead color we were fishing in what area. So like the final sessions when we were going through, I was able to pick up quite a few more fish by saying, hey, I'm gonna put a really dull bead color because I know these fish have seen a trillion flies already and they're scared to death. You know, yeah. Final things here, just more questions. So if anyone has any questions about Bosnia, any competitive fly fishing, anything like that. I also do want to throw out a little self-promotion. If anyone wants to learn more about any of these techniques or fishing in general, I'll be doing guiding both coming up and over the summer. So feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Charlie. He has all my contact info. I think I'll probably give anyone in Hamilton England Club like a 15% discount too. So I've been guiding for 4 years. See all my stuff. I like to catch fish, so we could go out and have a good time. But yeah, any questions just about anything?
So how far did the USA win by? Was it a big margin or was it really tight? Or what?
It was not tight. I believe we won by 32 placing points. We had 70, and then second place was over 100 with the French, which, if you look at the comparison, was one of the largest margins. I think the largest margin of win in the youth division in close to 20 years.
How many countries in it?
There was, I think, a dozen over. Don't quote me on that. I have to double check it, but I think around a dozen. Yeah, we put together a very strong pattern, and we also had what I'd like to call the dream team. We had just nonstop, truly incredible anglers. Shout out to everyone on our team. We have Alex, Max, Logan, Josh Mowers in the back, Hayden, Cage Cossler, Drew Bone, Lawson Braun, Blake Hall, and myself in that. And also we had Tucker Horn, who was out helping us as our manager as well. And just truly one of the greatest teams I've ever been on, and just phenomenal fishermen all around. So putting that together with finding some great patterns through all these techniques, finding some great flies, and just molding well as a team. We love I love all these guys. You know, we work together great as a team. Put that all together, that allowed us to have one of the largest margins of a win in over 20 years. So.
And if you had to talk about what percentage of your fish you caught, what methods, how would you split that up?
So, I got, for my personal fishing, I got pretty unlucky that most of my beats looked like this, which meant I had one sector that I was really able to effectively Euronymph. Where we were able to Euronymph, eggs were very effective, and jump was very effective for the stockers, and Euronymphing was very effective. So when you can Euronymphing was the move for the most part. But for me, because I wasn't able to do a lot of Euronymphing, I'd say I caught majority of my fish on streamers on sinking line, followed up by single dry and skating dries. And then I didn't do as much long line nymphing just because I didn't have as much confidence in the technique at the time. It's just a technique that I know would be incredibly effective here when you learn. I'd say I caught some there, but my main techniques outside of Euronymphing where I could would be that sinking line on streamers and single dry. In scenarios that wouldn't work, the jig streamer and the other techniques work well, but I point to this when I point to a lot of these techniques as proof that competition fishing is not just about Euronymphing. It is. Euronymphing's effective. When you can use it, it works great. But when you get thrown into a scenario where this was my beat, I look out and I only saw one rising fish. I go, well, this is going to be fun, you know? Being able to do a lot more. If I just walked in with like a single nymph and started Euronymphing, nothing was going to happen. But I was able to come into this beat, which produced a blink before me, a blink behind me. I saw the rising fish, picked up the rising fish, started pulling streamers, and was able to pick I think 6 or 7 fish out of the beat, which took me either 3 or 4 on the second, which was very good considering the beat was just didn't pick up fish. So if you're able to have a lot of these techniques over Euronymphing or alongside Euronymphing, you're able to catch a lot of fish in a lot more challenging, difficult situations and scenarios than you would be if you couldn't do that. Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions about the slides or anything else?
How do you strike on the streamers in that situation?
That'd still be a strip set. With all the sinking line, it's the same deal as what you run with legs. If you pull up like this, you'll probably miss the bite. Even if you don't miss the bite, now you have to deal with like all the line coming in towards you. So it's a lot harder time keeping that fish hooked. So strip set, but especially there with those softmouth trout and with some of the stalkers that we're catching too, they have very soft mouths. So if you kind of ripped into that strip set, like what we like to do here in New Zealand, you pull it straight through the mouth and you never catch them. So I could be like jigging aggressively like this, and when I got my bite, I just do a softer strip set and I'm actually even fully jigging, because to keep those fish pinned, especially with the weight of a sinking line and the current, all you have to do is just pull it 1-2 inches into their mouth and not really rip into them, because I can pull through the mouth. So with those smaller fish, when you're getting the bites, it was almost like a tap. You're almost tapping them on, as opposed to a really hard rip strip set like we do at Marai Thai when we get that bite. Oh yeah, you know, quite different in that scenario. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, we got our extra fun
Photo
part.
session.
Our Oda Sleigh Fest. Here's some photos from that infamous day of Ollie and I. We had a real fun time. This was my biggest buck. Yeah, that went 77 or 78 centimeter. I think it weighed under 10 pounds, but I don't care. That thing was sick. Like, that's such a cool looking fish. Ollie got this absolute hog, and then we got a bunch of fish around that range, 60 something centimeter range, which Odomenical, in my experience out here, is just a stunning lake, and putting a fish like this is just truly incredible. So what were we doing? We caught every fish on a plonking technique. Plonking is not something brand new to you guys, but there's definitely some tricks that we're using that allowed us to put in more fish in the boat. Number one, so what we had in our floating line, we were using 5-weight lines, even though we had 7-weight rods. Allowed us a little bit more control of the cast, and also that's just how we both plonked. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a plonking expert, but I've definitely learned a thing or two since I've been out here. We have 9 foot, which is 3 meter of our 4 to 5 foot, 4 to 5x tapered leader to a tippet ring. From our tippet ring, we have a little bit of thicker tippet heading to our plonking dry fly. Now, important thing about the plonking dry fly is both of us, we use different drives for plonking, but both of them allowed us to see when we got connected by twitching up, pulling tight. So it would lay on the water, and when we got connected, it would pull it tight. This allowed us to have a really good idea of when our flies are connected, when we expect to get that bite. If a fish eats while swimming up, we'd watch our dry, lay back down, and you'd strike on the dry fly actually losing connection, which is a bite that most people would normally miss. So having an indicator that allows you to know when you're connected and not connected will definitely increase your hookup ratio. That's a little bit rare, but did actually happen to one of the fish that day. I was watching my indicator and I saw it connected, and I saw it go, it's like, that's a bit weird. Oh! So it's definitely a technique, but the more important aspect of that indicator being up versus low is you're able to cast near a weed edge, and when you cast near that weed edge, if your flies are stuck on weeds, it would never pull connected. So you'd be able to pull it out and not waste your time on that cast, or pull it at least away from the weeds to a point where it will get connected, and always know when your flies are actually in the fishing zone as opposed to just being on those weeds, which there's a lot of weeds at Odomenical. What we had, we're fishing deep plonking rigs. So I know in a lot of places like Kiritawa, shallower rig works really well, and probably Odomenical in the right time of year. I haven't fished out the right time of year. But what we were doing is we're going around 1 to 2 meter, even on the shore side, maybe 80 centimeter to the first fly, and then another 1 to 2 to the second fly. So we're fishing pretty deep setups. Meter's not my forte, but you know, we're fishing very deep setups on the plonking rigs, because if you remember, the water temperature on that day was very cold, so the fish were pretty dormant, they're pretty low activity. The flies we were fishing, these are just flies that you generally will use. Nibs, leeches, damsels, snails, worms. We're mostly working with, I believe it was pheasant tails and worms. We caught a couple on some other whack stuff, but it was really, I believe, the pheasant tail that was really the money fly for that day. But I think a lot of it was getting it down in that really cold
What size
water.
beads you got on them? I can't see.
I have 2 mil to 3 mil. So I believe we were, on that day as well, we had 2.5 on the top dropper and 3 mil on the bottom dropper for the most part. There's a couple places where we change up depending on like depth, everything else. But 2.5 top dropper, 3 mil bottom dropper on that deep plonking rig worked really well. I think the big thing, everyone's like, what's the difference? Like, we were plonking. What caused you guys to put 36 fish in the boat and us to, not? The big thing that we discovered on that day is the fish were holding very close to the weeds. They're holding deep and they're holding close to the weeds. And one of the reasons is weeds will stay slightly warmer than the actual outside water temperature. And that's the same with a lot of structure. Rock will stay slightly warmer. So when you have that very cold water temperature, I'll find fish hold very tight to pieces of structure. So what Ollie and I were doing was very similar. If we scroll all the way back to that Spanish style dry, or if we're drifting along the weed edge, we cast straight at it. Our plonking dry will land slightly next to it. Our flies will land on the weed bed, that won't work. If we cast far enough so the flies won't land, they'll swing out and stay pretty far away from the weed edge. So what we were doing is we're actually casting sideways, so our cast would lay out straight, and then our flies would go parallel, and that would allow them to sink right next to that weed edge and stay within, half a meter of that weed edge as we're drifting, and that would really, that's where we're finding all the fish, really close as we physically could to the weeds. The difference between half a meter and a full meter away from the weeds was the difference between catching fish and not, a lot of the times during that session at least. So techniques, just getting it really putting it in the right spot near that weed edge is really what we keyed in. In the morning, it's a bit slow, and then we started figuring out how close we needed to put it. If you guys watched us, a lot of times, like, Ollie and I would be like standing on the boat, we'd be like, oh, there's a weed edge. Putting it like right along on that weed edge and making it so the flies would fall horizontally right next to it, as opposed to kind of sliding over.
That's really interesting.
It worked. We were able to put in some pretty hefty fish. It was a phenomenal day. Good vibes, we had music playing. Excited to go back to
I can hear you singing.
Yeah, we were just singing, eating our sandwiches. Woo! There's one. So it was definitely, of many lakes, I actually haven't fished that many lakes here, but it's definitely been one of my favorite lakes I've come out here and fished a lot, because you hook fish like this. So for that Odominicow trip that Charlie's planning, I would absolutely suggest you guys sign up, because you got a chance to fish like that, which is just truly incredible. So.
How long would you be leaving the flies sit for? Moving them somewhere else? Depends how fast you're drifting, I guess. But.
Yeah, it depends. The standard rule I've heard is with plonking, you cast it, you count how long it takes to sink. So on a rig like that, it would take I think 10 to 12 seconds for that whole rig to sink down, and then you double it. So let's say 10 seconds, you count to 20 and then you cast to the next spot. At Odomedical, we're definitely giving it a lot more time, because if you get, that cast was not easy putting it right along that edge. If you get a really good cast along that edge, you kind of want to let it sit there and marinate. So a lot of times we'd be casting 20 plus meter to get it to the edge, and we just wait till we drift up on it. We give it the entire time to just marinate right along that edge. But really, it depended. If we could make a good cast, it takes time to sink all that, and you're drifting so fast. So if we made a cast that we thought was good along that edge, we'd let it sit there basically as long as we could, or as long until we go, I like that edge, and put it over to the next edge. So I think letting it marinate, especially in a place like Odomedical, that's a finky place. I don't think hammering the water is necessarily the best technique there. It's kind of just...
The other thing you might do, Tom, is you might just pull it half a metre or something, because you sometimes get a reaction from a fish that's sitting looking at it. So you just move it a bit, and sometimes they'll grab it, rather than pull it right out and put it back in, because it's so difficult. I didn't realise that's what they were doing, but that's what made the difference, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Was putting the fly so close to the weed,
Yeah.
which is very clever.
That's...
Which, we never thought could be done. That'll be it. Won't be the flies or anything else.
No, it really, because that's one thing we've learned is...
We've all got pheasant tails.
Yeah, I've found, I've been able to travel all across the world and fish in tons of competitions like this. It's never the fly. I love the flies, but it's, a lot of times it's just, there's so much more technique and thought and skill. And I'm still calm. I don't know anything. I don't know shit. The amount I get to go out and the amount I'll learn just on a day-to-day basis about one thing or the other is just incredible. Getting to fish with alligator fish with lots of incredibly skilled anglers. They're like, well, I like to do it like this. And I'm like, oh, why? And they explain it, and I go, So there's tons of little tricks and aspects. That's what I love about fly fishing. I'm still a child, but you can never stop learning. There's no point where you know everything. There's no point where you've gotten the tip of the iceberg. I personally think every day there's something that can turn it into a day like what we had, where we're able to put 36 fish in the boat. I think every scenario you can find something that can turn it to that, and whoever finds said technique, style, trick is the one who's going to come back and be like, what? So I've been lucky enough in some scenarios and some comps to find that. For example, big throwback to that 87 fish session, I was able to find a way where I was pulling my line and a area. I found fish in way shallower water than you expect, but they only would eat larger flies if you pulled it faster. So I was able to put that all together, and I was able to be like, well, whack, 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 and catch 87 fish in 2 hours just going through, because I found they're in shallow water and bigger flies, which is just a very rare technique that you find in Colorado, where I did it. So no one else found. That's the same at Odomedical if you find that one technique like that. And then on the other hand, you'll go to Facambario on Saturday and not get a bite. So, it's like, you have one end where you're like, wow, this technique's great. I feel like a good fisherman. And then you're like, oh man. It's a constant. That's fishing. And there's so much science, technique, strategy, skill, experience that can be put into every aspect of it. And, eventually, I don't know, like 1% what there is to know, so.
That's great, Noah. Thank you. So, normally we give our speakers a bottle of wine, but because Noah in his own country is not of drinking age yet, we thought we'd give him a bottle of water. Oh, wait a minute, we've got something else in here for you. So we've got one other thing, if you want to open that. Do you want to put the lights on? Whoever's on? Oh, thanks, Richard.